The temple vessels. Jeremiah's task had been twofold. Besides being in charge over the people in exile, God had also entrusted him with the care of the sanctuary and all it contained. The Holy Ark, the altar of incense, and the Holy Tent were carried by an angel to the mountain where Moses had viewed the Promised Land before his death. There, Jeremiah found a spacious cave in which he hid these sacred utensils. Some of his companions followed him to see where he hid it, but they were not able to keep up. When Jeremiah later heard of their attempt, he broke off the friendships, for God wants to keep the hiding place to remain a secret until the redemption, and then God himself will make the hidden things visible. Even the temple vessels not concealed by Jeremiah were prevented from falling into the hands of the enemy. The gates of the temple sank into the earth, and other parts and utensils were hidden in a tower at Baghdad by the Levite Shemur and his friends. Among these utensils was the 7-branch candlestick of pure gold, every branch set with 26 pearls, and besides the pearls, 200 stones of priceless value. Furthermore, the tower at Baghdad was the hiding place for 77 golden tables, and for the gold which decorated the walls of the temple, inside and out. The tables had been taken from paradise by Solomon, and in brilliance they outshine the sun and the moon, while the gold from the walls exceed the worth of all other gold found from the creation of the world until the destruction of the temple. The jewels, pearls, gold, silver, and precious gems, which David and Solomon intended for the temple, were discovered by the scribe Hilkiah, and he delivered them to the angel Shamshiel, who in turn deposited the treasures in Borsippa. The sacred musical instruments were hidden by Baruch and Zedekiah, until the advent of the Messiah, who will reveal all treasures. In his time, a stream will break forth from under the place of the Holy of Holies, and will flow through the lands to the Euphrates, and as it flows, it will uncover all the treasures buried in the earth. At the time of the destruction of the temple, one of the prominent figures was Baruch, the faithful attendant of Jeremiah. God commanded him to leave the city one day before the enemy entered it, in order that his presence might also not render it impregnable. On the following day, he and all the other pious men who had abandoned Jerusalem saw from a distance the angels descend, set fire to the city walls, and conceal the sacred vessels of the temple. At first, his grieving over the misfortunes of Jerusalem and the people knew no bounds, but he was, in a measure, consoled at the end of a 7-day fast, when God made it known to him that a day of reckoning would come for the heathen also. Other divine visions were given him. The whole future of mankind was unrolled before his eyes, especially the history of Israel, and he learned that the coming of the Messiah would put an end to all sorrow and misery, and usher in a reign of peace and joy among men. As for him, he would be removed from the earth, he was told, but not through death, and only in order to be kept in a safe place against the coming of the end of time. Thus consoled, Baruch wrote letters of admonition to the people left in Palestine and to those captive in Babylon, the letters carried to them by an eagle. 5 years after the great catastrophe, he composed a book in Babylon, which contained penitential prayers and hymns of consolation, exhorting Israel and urging the people to return to God and his law. This book Baruch read to King Jeconiah and the whole people on a day of prayer and penitence. On the same occasion, a collection was taken up among the people, and those funds, together with the silver vessels, made by order of Zedekiah after Jeconiah had been carried away captive, were sent to Jerusalem, with the request that the high priest Joachim and the people apply the money to the sacrificial service, and to prayers for the life of King Nebuchadnezzar and his son Belshazzar, hoping by doing so they might ensure peace and happiness under Babylonian rule. Above all, they were to supplicate God to turn away his wrath from the people. Baruch also sent his book to the residents of Jerusalem, and they read it in the temple on distinguished days and recited the prayers it contains. Baruch is one of the few mortals who have been privileged to visit paradise and know its secrets. An angel of the Lord appeared to him while he was lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem and took him to the 7 heavens, to the place of judgment where the doom of the godless is pronounced, and to the abodes of the blessed. He was still among the living when Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Palestine, but on account of his old age, he could not take advantage of the permission. So long as he was alive, his disciple Ezra remained with him in Babylon, for the study of the law is more important than the building of the temple. It was only after the death of Baruch that he decided to gather together the exiles who desired to return to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. The tombs of Baruch and Ezekiel. The piety of Baruch and the great favor he enjoyed with God were made known to later generations many years later through the marvelous occurrences connected with his tomb. Once a Babylonian prince commanded a Jew, Rabbi Solomon by name, to show him the grave of Ezekiel, concerning which he had heard many remarkable tales. The Jew advised the prince first to enter the tomb of Baruch, which adjoined that of Ezekiel. Having succeeded in this, he might attempt the same with the tomb of Ezekiel, the teacher of Baruch. In the presence of his grandees and his people, the prince tried to open the grave of Baruch, but his efforts were fruitless. Whoever touched it was at once stricken dead. An old Arab advised the prince to call on the Jews to gain entrance for him, seeing that Baruch had been a Jew, and his books were still being studied by Jews. The Jews prepared themselves by fasts, prayers, penitence, and almsgiving, and they succeeded in opening the grave without a mishap. Baruch was found lying on a marble slab, and the appearance of the corpse was as though he had just passed away. The prince ordered the casket to be brought to the city and the body to be entombed there. He thought it was not seemly that Ezekiel and Baruch should rest in the same grave. But the bearers found it impossible to remove the casket more than 2,000 ells from the original grave. Not even with the help of numerous oxen could it be urged a single step further. Following the advice of Rabbi Solomon, the prince resolved to inter the casket on that very spot, and also to erect an academy there. These miraculous happenings prompted the prince to go to Mecca. There he became convinced of the falseness of Mohammedanism, of which he had been a follower, and he converted to Judaism, he and his whole court. Not less famous is the tomb of Ezekiel, at a distance of 2,000 ells from Baruch's. It is arched by a beautiful mausoleum, erected by King Jeconiah after evil Merodach had released him from captivity. The mausoleum existed down to the Middle Ages, and it bore on its walls the names of 35,000 Jews who had assisted Jeconiah in erecting the monument. It was the scene of many miracles. When great crowds of people went there to pay reverence to the memory of the prophet, the little gate in the wall surrounding the grave enlarged in width and height to admit all who wanted to enter. Once a prince vowed to give a colt to the grave of the prophet, if his mare, which had been sterile until then, would bear a colt. When his wish was fulfilled, however, he did not keep his promise, but the filly ran a distance equal to a 4 days' journey to the tomb, and his owner could not recover it until he paid its value in silver. When the people went on long journeys, they were in the habit of carrying their treasures to the grave of the prophet, and beseeching him to let none but the rightful heirs remove them. The prophet always granted their petition. Once, when an attempt was made to steal some books from the grave of Ezekiel, the thief suddenly became sick and blind. For a time, a pillar of fire, visible at a great distance, rose above the grave of the prophet, but it disappeared as a consequence of the unseemly conduct of the pilgrims who went there. Not far from the grave of Ezekiel was the grave of Berozak, who once appeared to a rich Jew in a dream. He spoke, "I am Berozak, one of the princes who were led into captivity with Jeremiah. I am one of the just. If you will erect a handsome mausoleum for me, you will be blessed with children." And he who had been childless shortly after became a father. Daniel. The most distinguished member of the Babylonian diaspora was Daniel. Though not a prophet, he was surpassed by none in wisdom, piety, and good deeds. His firm adherence to Judaism was displayed from his early youth. when, as a page at the royal court, he refused to partake of the bread, wine, and oil of the heathen, even though the enjoyment of them was not prohibited by law. In general, his prominent position at court was maintained at the cost of many a hardship, for he and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were envied their distinctions by numerous enemies, who sought to bring about their ruin. Once they were accused before King Nebuchadnezzar of leading an unchaste life. The king resolved to order their execution. But Daniel and his friends mutilated certain parts of their bodies and so demonstrated how unfounded the charges against them were. Daniel gave evidence of his wisdom even as a youth, when he convicted two old sinners for having testified falsely against Susanna, as beautiful as she was good. Misled by the perjured witnesses, the court had condemned Susanna to death. Then Daniel, impelled by a higher power, appeared among the people, proclaimed that wrong had been done, and demanded that the case be reopened. And so it was. Daniel himself cross-examined one witness after the other. The same questions were addressed to both, and as the replies did not agree with each other, the false witnesses stood condemned, and they were made to suffer the penalty the court would have put on their victim. Daniel's high position dates from the time when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The king said to the astrologers and magicians, "I know my dream, but I do not want to tell you what it was, or else you will invent anything at all and pretend it is the interpretation of the dream. But if you tell me the dream, then I will have confidence in your interpretation." After much talk between Nebuchadnezzar and his wise men, they confessed that the king's wish might have been fulfilled, if only the temple still existed. The high priest at Jerusalem might have revealed the secret by consulting the Urim and Thummim. At this point, the king became quite angry against his wise men, the same ones who had previously advised him to destroy the temple, even though they must have known how useful it might have been to the king and to the state. He ordered them all executed. Their life was saved by Daniel, who recited the king's dream and gave its interpretation. The king was so filled with admiration of Daniel's wisdom that he paid him divine honors. Daniel, however, refused such extravagant treatment. He did not want to be the object of idolatrous veneration. He left Nebuchadnezzar in order to escape the marks of honor thrust on him and went to Tiberias, where he built a canal. Besides, he was charged by that king to bring fodder for cattle from Babylonia and also swine from Alexandria. During Daniel's absence, Nebuchadnezzar set up an idol, and its worship was expected from all his subjects, under the penalty of death by fire. The image could not stand on account of the disproportion between its height and thickness. All the gold and silver captured by the Babylonians in Jerusalem was needed to give it steadiness. All the nations under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, including even Israel, obeyed the royal command to worship the image. Only the three pious companions of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, resisted the order. In vain, Nebuchadnezzar urged an argument in favor of idolatry, that the Jews had been so devoted to heathen practices before the destruction of Jerusalem that they had been forced to Babylonia for the purpose of imitating the idols there and bringing copies of those idols back to Jerusalem. The three saints would not listen to these seductions, nor when he referred them to such authorities as Moses and Jeremiah, in order to prove to them that they were under obligation to do the royal bidding. They said, "You are our king in all that concerns service, taxes, poll money, and tribute. But with respect to your present command, you are only Nebuchadnezzar. To us you are like a dog. Go ahead, inflate yourself up like a water bottle, and chirp like a cricket." Nebuchadnezzar could not believe his ears. They had spoken this to him in the presence of others. His wrath transcended all bounds, and he ordered the three to be cast into a red-hot furnace, so hot that the flames flashed to a height of 40 ells above the chimney, and consumed the heathen standing about. No less than 4 nations were exterminated. While the 3 saints were being thrown into the furnace, they addressed a fervent prayer to God, supplicating His grace and begging Him to put their adversaries to shame. The angels wanted to rescue the 3 men, but God said, "Did the 3 men act for your sakes? No, they did it for me, and I will save them with my own hands." God also rejected the well-meant services of Yerkami, the angel of hail, who offered to extinguish the fire in the furnace. The angel Gabriel pointed out that such a miracle would not be sufficiently striking. His proposition was accepted. He, the angel of fire, was to snatch the 3 men from the red-hot furnace. He executed his mission by cooling off the fire inside the oven, while on the outside the heat increased to such a degree that the heathen standing around the furnace were consumed. The 3 youths then raised their voices together in a hymn of praise, thanking God for His miraculous help. The Chaldeans observed the 3 men pacing up and down quietly in the furnace, followed by a 4th, the angel Gabriel, as an attendant. Nebuchadnezzar, who hurried to see the wonder, was stunned with fright, for he recognized Gabriel, the same angel who in the guise of a column of fire had blasted the army of Sennacherib. 6 other miracles happened, all of them driving terror to the heart of the king. The fiery furnace, which had been sunk in the ground, raised itself into the air. It was broken. The bottom dropped out. The image erected by Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate. 4 nations were destroyed by fire, and Ezekiel revived the dead in the valley of Dura. Of the last, Nebuchadnezzar was told in a peculiar way. He had a drinking vessel made of the bones of a slain Jew. When he was about to use it, life began to stir in the bones, and a blow was planted to the king's face, while a voice announced, "A friend of this man's is now reviving the dead." Nebuchadnezzar now offered praise to God for the miracles performed. And if an angel had not quickly struck him a blow on the mouth and forced him into silence, his psalms of praise would have excelled the Psalter of David. The deliverance of the 3 pious young men was a brilliant vindication of their ways, but at the same time it caused great mortification to the masses of the Jewish people, who had complied with the order of Nebuchadnezzar and had worshipped his idol. Accordingly, when the 3 men left the furnace, which they did not do until Nebuchadnezzar invited them, the heathen struck all the Jews they met in the face, deriding them, saying, "You who have so wondrous a God, pay homage to idols?" The 3 men left Babylon and went to Palestine, where they joined their friend the high priest Joshua. The readiness to sacrifice their lives for the honor of God had been all the more remarkable as they had been told by the prophet Ezekiel that no miracle would be done for their sakes. When the king's command to bow down before the idol was published, the 3 men were appointed to act as representatives of the people. Hananiah and his companions resorted to Daniel for his advice. He referred them to the prophet Ezekiel, who counseled flight, citing his teacher Isaiah as the authority. The 3 men rejected his advice and declared themselves ready to suffer the death of martyrs. Ezekiel told them to wait until he asked God whether a miracle would be done for them. The words of God were, "I will not manifest myself as their Savior. They caused my house to be destroyed, my palace to be burned, my children to be dispersed among the heathen, and now they appeal for my help. As I live, I will not be found by them." Instead of discouraging the 3 men, this answer only infused them with new spirit and resolution, and they declared with even more emphasis than before that they were ready to meet death. God consoled the weeping prophet by revealing to him that he would save the 3 saintly heroes. He had tried to restrain them from martyrdom only to let their piety and steadfastness appear even brighter. On account of their piety, it became customary to swear by the name of Him who supports the world on 3 pillars, the pillars being the saints Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their deliverance from death by fire worked a great effect on the disposition of the heathen. They were convinced of the uselessness of their idols, and with their own hands they destroyed them. Ezekiel revives the dead. Among the dead Ezekiel restored to life, at the same time the 3 young men were saved from the fiery furnace, were different classes of people. Some were the Ephraimites who had perished in the attempt to escape from Egypt, before Moses led the whole nation out of the land of bondage. Some were the godless among the Jews that had polluted the temple at Jerusalem with heathen rites, and those still more godless who in life had not believed in the resurrection of the dead. Others revived by Ezekiel were the youths among the Jews carried away to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Their beauty was so radiant that it darkened the very splendor of the sun. The Babylonian women were seized with a great passion for them, and at the solicitation of their husbands, Nebuchadnezzar ordered a bloody massacre of the handsome youths. But the Babylonian women were not yet cured of their unlawful passion. The beauty of the young Hebrews haunted them until their corpses lay crushed before them, their graceful bodies mutilated. Lastly, he revived some who had perished only a short time before. When Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were saved from death, Nebuchadnezzar addressed the other Jews, those who had yielded obedience to his command concerning the worship of the idol. He said, "You know your God can help and save. Nevertheless, you paid worship to an idol which is incapable of doing anything. This proves that as you have destroyed your own land by your wicked deeds, now you are trying to destroy my land." Then he commanded that they all be executed, 60,000 of them. 20 years later, Ezekiel was given a vision in which God told him to go to the valley of Dura, where Nebuchadnezzar had set up his idol and had massacred that host of Jews. Here, God showed him the dry bones of those with the question, "Can I revive these bones?" Ezekiel's answer was evasive, and as punishment for his little faith, he had to end his days in Babylon and was not even granted burial in the soil of Palestine. God then dropped the dew of heaven on the dry bones. Sinews came back, flesh came up, and skin covered them. At the same time, God sent winds to the 4 corners of the earth, which unlocked the treasure houses of the souls and brought its own soul back to each body. All came to life except one man, who, as God explained to the prophet, was excluded from the resurrection because he was a usurer. In spite of the marvelous miracle performed for them, the men restored to life wept because they feared they would have no share at the end of time in the resurrection of the whole Israel. But the prophet assured them in the name of God that their portion in all that had been promised Israel would be in no way diminished. Nebuchadnezzar, a beast. Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the whole world, to whom even the wild animals paid obedience, his pet was a lion with a snake wrapped around its neck, did not escape punishment for his sins. He was chastised as no one before him. He, who had at first held back from a war against Jerusalem because of fear of God, and who had to be dragged forcibly as he sat on his horse to the Holy of Holies by the Archangel Michael, later became so arrogant that he thought himself a god, and had a plan of enveloping himself in a cloud, so that he might live apart from men. A heavenly voice resounded, "Oh, you wicked man, son of a wicked man, descendant of Nimrod the wicked, who incited the world to rebellion. Behold, the years of man are 70, or perhaps by reason of strength, 80. It takes 500 years to traverse the distance from the earth to the first heaven, and as long to penetrate from the bottom to the top of the first heaven, and no less the distances from one of the 7 heavens to the next. How then can you speak of ascending like the Most High, above the heights of the clouds?" For this transgression of deeming himself more than a man, he was punished by being made to live for some time as a beast among beasts, treated by them as though he were one of them. For 40 days he led this life. As far down as his navel he had the appearance of an ox, and the lower part of his body resembled that of a lion. he ate grass like an ox, and like a lion he attacked a curious crowd. But Daniel spent his time in prayer, entreating that the 7 years of this brutish life allotted to Nebuchadnezzar might be reduced to 7 months. His prayer was granted. At the end of 40 days, reason returned to the king. The next 40 days he passed in weeping bitterly over his sins, and in the interval that remained to complete the 7 months, he again lived the life of a beast. Hiram. Hiram, the king of Tyre, was a contemporary of Nebuchadnezzar, and in many respects resembled him. He too esteemed himself a god, and tried to make men believe in his divinity by the artificial heavens he fashioned for himself. In the sea he erected 4 iron pillars, from which he built up 7 heavens, each 500 ells larger than the one below. The first was a plate of glass 500 square ells, the second a plate of iron 1,000 square ells, the third of lead, and separated from the second by canals, containing huge round boulders, which produced the sound of thunder on the iron. The fourth heaven was of brass, the fifth of copper, the sixth of silver, and the seventh of gold, all separated from each other by canals. In the seventh, 3,500 ells in extent, he had diamonds and pearls, which he manipulated so as to produce the effect of flashes of lightning, while the stones below imitated the growling of thunder. As Hiram was thus floating above the earth, in his vain imagination deeming himself superior to the rest of men, he suddenly perceived the prophet Ezekiel next to himself. He had been blown there by a wind. Frightened and amazed, Hiram asked the prophet how he had risen to his heights. The answer was, "God brought me here, and he told me to ask you why you are so proud, you born of woman." The king replied defiantly, "I am not one born of woman. I live forever, and as God resides on the sea, so my abode is on the sea, and as he inhabits 7 heavens, so do I. Look how many kings I have survived, 21 from the house of David, and as many from the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and no less than 50 prophets and 10 high priests have I buried." Then God said, "I will destroy my house, that from this time forward Hiram will have no reason for self-glorification, because all his pride comes only from the circumstance that he furnished the cedar trees for the building of the temple." The end of this proud king was that he was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, deprived of his throne, and made to suffer a cruel death. Though the Babylonian king was the stepson of Hiram, he had no mercy. Daily he cut off a bit of flesh from his body and forced the king to eat it until he finally perished. Hiram's palace was swallowed by the earth, and in the bowels of the earth it will remain until it emerges in the future world as the habitation of the pious. False prophets. Not only the heathen, but also the Jews were very sinful in those days. The most notorious Jewish sinners were the 2 false prophets, Ahab and Zedekiah. Ahab came to the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar and said, "Yield yourself to Zedekiah," pretending that it was a divine message. The same was done by Zedekiah, who only varied the message by substituting the name of Ahab. The princess could not accept such messages as divine, and she told her father what had occurred. Though Nebuchadnezzar was so addicted to immoral practices that he was in the habit of making his captive kings drunk and then satisfying his unnatural lusts on them, a miracle shielded the pious of Judah against this disgrace. Yet he knew full well that the God of the Jews hates immorality. He then questioned Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the messages to his daughter, and they emphatically denied the possibility that such a message could come from God. The prophets of lies refused to recall their statements, and Nebuchadnezzar decided to subject them to the same fiery test he had decreed for the 3 pious companions of Daniel. To be fair toward them, the king permitted them to choose a 3rd fellow sufferer, some pious man to share their lot. Seeing no escape, Ahab and Zedekiah asked for Joshua, later the high priest, as their companion in the furnace, in the hope that his distinguished merits would suffer to save all three of them. They were mistaken. Joshua emerged unhurt. Only his garments were seared, but the false prophets were consumed. Joshua explained the singeing of his garments by the fact that he was directly exposed to the full fury of the flames. But the truth was that he had to pay for the sins of his sons, who had contracted marriages unworthy of their dignity. Therefore, the father escaped death only after the fire had burned his garments. Next, Daniel's piety. End Part 90 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.